So welcome. I am Jason Bobe, an associate professor at the Icahn Institute and the Institute for Next Generation Healthcare at Mount Sinai in New York City. It's my great privilege to moderate this panel discussion today, which will be excellent, particularly with this amazing group of panelists who are all working at the frontiers of participant-centered research. So I'm going to start by giving some editorial about that. Participant-centered research is something that isn't new. It's just substantially more youthful than its forerunner, patient-centered medicine, which has been around for nearly half a century. The nonprofit Plaintree started evaluating and rating hospitals for their patient-centeredness when it was established in 1978, which was making it and me, this was the year I was born, almost 40 and over the hill. So patient-centered research is quite a bit more recent than that, but it does promise to be at least, if not more, disruptive. So throughout most of the history of biomedical research, we've stuck to very rigid roles. On the one hand, you have the researcher, and on the other hand, you have the subjects, each with their own specific domains and duties, and you were not to cross the streams. And often, and unfortunately in this framework, subjects were too often treated as sort of cogs in the wheel. They powered the p-values, but they were not empowered in other important ways. And this system was often one that was just purely transactional. Subjects recruited to a study where all the elements had already been decided. Their only responsibility was to sign a consent form, give a tube of blood, answer a few questions, and then promptly be forgotten and go away. And when several years later, if a journal article came out of it, it was often put behind a paywall that was inaccessible to everybody except for the same pointy-head academics living in ivory towers who also withheld data from most people too. So all of this, it's sort of then, there's no wonder that there is, in some ways, a crisis in biomedical research, one of participation. Most people don't participate in organized health research. So I think we should make this session participatory right from the beginning and test this out empirically. So by a show of hands, how many people in this room are currently enrolled in at least one organized health research, which I define as you've signed a consent form and you could withdraw if you wanted to? So for those of you watching on the video, I don't know what that is, 5%, 10%, something of that order. I think you probably agree with that. So there you go. Meanwhile, consumer industries have embraced service design, practices like human-centered design, design thinking. Customers are treated as the ultimate experts in their needs and their desires. And in this context, products are co-designed, and they're improved iteratively based on feedback from actual users and consumers. So the biomedical and clinical research enterprise has been moving in this direction. We now have ideals and principles for patient, participant, and people-centered research. There's been the incorporation of patient-reported outcomes. There are increasingly equitable data sharing practices, which would include equal access to individual-level uninterpreted research data, silo-busting activities of open science and open access publications, etc. More recently, citizen science approaches, where research subjects are crossing over and becoming co-investigators, in some cases PIs, leading research themselves and treating scientists as consultants to their endeavor. Crowdsourcing and co-design practices. And also, we have a host of new tools like mobile phone-based apps and sensors galore, making widespread engagement in all aspects of research a possibility today. So through all of these activities, there is a sort of nascent architecture of participation emerging, where we're better equipped, more than we ever have been, to create research studies that people actually want to sign up for. And with all of these advancements, we no longer need to start at square one and defend the empowerment of research participants or talk about why it might be beneficial if they were to transition from passive subjects to partners. So it's widely understood now that widespread participation in research depends on making the enterprise more transparent, equitable, and responsive. Having more feedback earlier will lead to better outcomes overall. So with all of that, it is a very exciting time in biomedical research. The revolution is well underway. And here we are, Partnering for Cures this year in Boston, the very heart of revolutionary spirit. Out the window, literally steps away from the Freedom Trail, Faneuil Hall, the Old South Meeting House, pivotal places in the plot to escape the dominion of King George III. Cue the Hamilton musical music, please. So what we're about to hear is what's happening, what we're learning from the frontiers of this revolution. And so to get started, what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and give us some specific examples or new approaches that they're involved with in engaging patients in clinical research. And as you listen, please be thinking about your questions for this great group of panelists. Because there will be more participatory features coming towards the end. So let's start with Kristen. There you are.
I am indeed.
Hi. So you are at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and as a funder, you really have the power to operationalize patient centricity more so than many people. So can you give us some examples of what you're seeing in patient engagement?
I can. I'm just going to take a moment to explain a little bit about myself. I'm here as Joe's stand-in today. He was he ended up doing the talk this morning. And I provide that because I've been at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute for about 6 months. I have a long background in patient engagement, researching, developing interventions, et cetera. But I bring both an insider and a little bit of an outsider perspective to the work today. But I do note if there's any questions I can't answer, Joe's going to answer for me. He has an encyclopedic knowledge about virtually every project that's ever happened at PCORI. And I think he may have mentioned earlier, I do want to take a step back because what's fascinating about PCORI is as an institution that was defined as patient-centered, and the board defined patient-centeredness around, we have to think about the outcomes of interest to patients, and the mechanism to getting there being engagement with the various stakeholders, including patients, is really crucial. And the way PCORI has operationalized those funding requirements is requiring participation of those stakeholders throughout the life cycle of the projects, right? And that includes recruitment, which is part of the topic of conversation today, as well as what's the relevance of research. Why is that important? Well, I think the extraordinary thing about the vision at that time was PCORI and its board decided to work with patients and other stakeholders to define patient-centeredness. So while the concept has lasted a long time, what's really radical is saying they're going to co-design it, co-define it at every stage of the process. And I think that's a really important innovation for us to remember. At the same time, PCORI created a multitude of structures and processes to support and require engagement throughout the life cycle, setting up the question, recruitment, analysis, dissemination. And a very thoughtful professor at Northwestern University once said one of the challenges of forging a new path is you don't really know if you're on a path or you're out somewhere on the brambles. And I think the nice thing for PCORI is they definitely have helped to forge a path, and I think there are some really interesting examples of, particularly in the area of recruitment, which is especially challenging. Obviously, costs are a problem. Getting people involved in studies is a problem. We have low recruitment rates. And that's the thing that PCORI takes really seriously, and we monitor closely and focus a lot of our engagement attention. So one of the things I want to talk to you about is what have our participants and PIs said has happened because of patient engagement in recruitment. And basically 100% of our PIs say that engagement has made a difference in their projects. So on a high level, I'm going to give you some examples. One is designing enrollment and study procedures to make more convenient for patients. And for any of the women here who've tried to use the bathroom, probably not designed by a woman, you understand the difference between something designed with your lived experience in mind and not, right? Very practical example. There's been a lot of extensively modifying outreach materials and recruitment procedures. And so, for example, switching from saying, hey, we've got this gate tool that's going to help you make decisions, to saying, this is actually created with patients and families. And the whole point of this is to improve how medical team communicates with families. And it's going to be a decision-making tool. We have a study where those kinds of changes improve participation by 30%. In another study, got tremendous input for a guide to the script that made it much more patient-centered. So when you say, we want to involve you, and are you an intermittent or non-daily smoker? Nobody defines themselves as that. It sounds simple, but it's not, right? How are we inviting you into the participation? In yet another study, patients made it clear no one was ever going to enter those studies, and they were not going to get recruited in if they didn't understand what the treatment was going to be, and these are people with PTSD and mental health issues. And so they made a tremendous difference, and the PI said, okay, I hear you, so we're going to explain it to you. Now, it caused a redesign in the study, but it also meant she went from 0 recruitment to 100% recruitment. That's a huge difference in an outcome in studies. In other cases, patients have helped to create shared decision-making tools for deciding to participate. In other cases, they've supported creating audio consent because historically disadvantaged communities, some individuals, low literacy, couldn't understand them and couldn't read them. And patients have done this in our studies by being key strategists. What are the barriers and facilitators? And we're going to tell you what they are before you even know what they are. Being liaisons between research teams and communities, supporting on-the-ground efforts, raising awareness, being co-producers of how to conduct the study and the key outcomes. And this is not just patients, by the way, it can be clinicians as well. We have studies where patients are like, we want to know about quality of life and outcomes. Clinicians like, okay, we buy that. We also want to understand how well patients are engaging, where both parties are at the table and coming up with a perspective. It affects the design, but obviously also affects recruitment because we need clinicians to support a lot of these recruitment efforts. I raise these exemplars, I think, to make a larger point. There are many possible challenges and thus solutions to a lot of our challenges with recruiting and participation in studies. And they need targeting particular circumstances and its context. Patients and stakeholders can identify those solutions. They can help you understand if other solutions can be adapted to your context and help you tailor. And I think ultimately, disruptive and innovative solutions, including technological solutions, meet human beings, right? So you have to meet them where they are. You have to understand how they see the world and what they want to accomplish. And only the participants themselves can actually explain that to you. And if there's a chance and everyone has questions, I can talk a little bit about how we've done the partnering. I think just one other thing I want to share is one of the things that I'm excited about, and I have the opportunity to support Joe and the institution, is helping them continue the effort of how to support projects and supporting that engagement. Because make no mistake, this is an innovation from soup to nuts, having patients involved. How do we support that innovation? How do we support those projects continuing to do it in a way that feels effective? We're also digging deeper, going into the field to find promising practices, to find the tools that work. Because for a lot of folks, it's got face validity. They want to know how to do it. We're trying better to help people understand how to do it. At the same time, we all have finite time and energy, including patients. And they also want to know, where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck for my participation? So the longer term outcomes and where those places are, we're working towards that. I think it's going to take a little more time, but that's a real priority.
Thank you. Sohini, so you're the Deputy CTO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, who has been an early adopter and leader in many ways in some of these practices. So what can you tell us about what you're up to in engaging patients in research?
Sure. So thank you. So just as a quick background, the Michael J. Fox Foundation is a relatively young organization. We're 17 years old, and we have a primary mission of funding research to find new therapies addressing Parkinson's disease. In the 17 years that we've been in existence, we funded over $650 million in research, and it's growing each year. All of this research is really devoted towards sort of translational and clinical research. And one of the great things that has happened, I've been at the foundation for 12 years, one of the great things that I've seen happen over these 12 years is that there's a really robust, vibrant clinical pipeline now of potential therapeutics, not just addressing the symptoms of the disease, but actually they may have actually the potential to modify the disease. So it's an extremely exciting time for Parkinson's research. But the champagne problem that we are now facing as we suddenly are beginning to see the fruits of these pushes in research is that we've got a lot of things that are going into clinical testing, and recruitment continues to be a very big issue. And so a lot of the comments that Kristen made earlier are things that we too are trying to address. But I might gear my remarks in a slightly different area of something that we're very excited about and that we're hoping is really going to change the way clinical research can be done in the future, and address some of the issues that patients face when they think about participating in clinical research. And that really is about leveraging technology. We live in a time where there are a lot of opportunities to leverage things as simple as an internet connection in your home to things that are more complex, utilizing sensors, whether they be placed on you, exist in your home, Wi-Fi, etc. But the common denominator amongst all of these different technologies is that it gives you the ability to participate in things without having to necessarily always go to a clinical site, travel, have to fill out lots of forms, etc. And it also is able to potentially capture what an individual is doing in their day-to-day existence. So it's not just about what the clinician is seeing, perceiving, asking, but it also allows us potentially the ability to see, do they lie in bed for 8 hours of the 12 hours that they're awake? Do they exit their home? Do they go outside? Do they cook for themselves, etc.? To be able to understand whether something, how something may be affecting the actual quality of life and day-to-day activities of an individual. So the two ways that we're doing this, and I'll be very brief about it, I'm happy to go into more detail later. One is we have an online study called Fox Insight, which is right now what we're calling in stealth mode. We haven't done a lot of public announcement about it. We sort of are kind of just trying to make sure it functions. But in the 18 months since it's up, we have over almost 7,000 people who've been using it. And what they do is they participate in a virtual visit. Every quarter, every 3 months, they come in and they provide information through certain surveys. Some of them actually also wear a wearable device that passively streams data. And all of this information is collected with the idea of being able to directly hear from the patient with a very low burden. All you need is a computer or laptop, tablet, whatever, and an internet connection and be 18 years or older. And just share your information. You can do the visit. It takes about 90 minutes. You could do it in one sitting. You could do it over the course of the 3 months. But the idea is to get it directly from patients in a very kind of easy, low-burden way, and then make this data available to the research community at large. The other way that we're trying to do this is actually utilize and understand how can we take some of the novel things like sensors, watches, there's devices that kind of like will monitor the Wi-Fi in your home and like bounce it off you so you can actually just have a Wi-Fi monitor and kind of see what a person's doing in their home. How can we use those things to also understand what does that tell us about a person's disease? In Parkinson's, we have a lot of movement issues, gait issues, etc. How can those devices help provide a much more holistic sense of what an individual is going in? And again, a low burden way. You wear a watch, you plug in something that goes into your Wi-Fi thing, and you just live your daily existence. And so these are just two examples of something that we're doing in parallel to our traditional kind of clinical studies that are still extremely important, but it gives you a little bit of sense of the potential of how we could rethink the way that we do clinical research and how we can make patients real partners in being able to share their day-to-day existence in a way that hopefully is not a huge lift.
Thank you. So, Anna, it's been said that one of the hardest problems in biomedicine is scaling good ideas. And I think most people here would agree that better engagement strategies is really important. And you're in an interesting position because you are really working from two scales, two sides of that. One, you have a startup company. Two, you are part of the All of Us research program, which hundreds of millions of dollars invested in that. And so you're sort of living and breathing at the frontiers of this. So what can you tell us about what we're learning in patient engagement, how to do it?
Well, I really think we're just beginning this journey in many respects. There's been a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of rhetoric about it. There's been a lot of conferences and meetings held on it. But I really feel like we're at a tipping point now where we may be able to actually start doing something different. I mean, so I come to this as a patient with type 1 diabetes. My background started in journalism, went into public affairs, got really frustrated, decided to go into healthcare, started my first startup about 7 years ago, focused on big data analytics, making data available to more people, democratizing that process, making it possible for people like me to be able to explore big data sets without having to learn to write computer code, because nobody wants that. That's sort of where I got started, and over the process became more and more engaged with FDA, focused on research, involved in a couple of research studies, and became incredibly frustrated with the slow pace of research and the rate of stagnation in research and research inquiry. And now I'm working with the Scripps Translational Science Institute. I'm a co-PI for the Precision Medicine Initiative, but I've also I've founded a company called Vital Crowd. Scripps is one of my partners for that, but the idea that we're trying to do with Vital Crowd is to really crowdsource all aspects of the research process, everything from defining what's important, letting people who live with disease, those of us who are experts in our own disease, to be able to propose studies, suggest research projects based on our own knowledge and our own expertise from living with disease. And one of the things that I realized after being in a study, first of all, I was my first study, I don't know, 4 years ago at this point, and I'm screened out of pretty much everything because I take 16 different medications now, use 8 different devices. I don't fit anyone's inclusion/exclusion criteria. Well, I finally fit one and realized within about 10 minutes living in the protocol why it is that there's such a high dropout rate, because everything about the process was designed for the benefit and convenience of everybody but the actual participants. And in this case, it was a particularly engaged population, people with type 1 diabetes who used insulin pumps, who happened to live near an academic medical research institute, who were willing to participate in trials. And the dropout rate for that particular trial was 70%, and ultimately they failed to keep enough people enrolled to actually meet their endpoint. So to me, that was a fascinating and frustrating enterprise on a personal level, but also on a macro level, thinking about what a waste that was, not just of resources, of time, but of the goodwill of those of us who actually live with disease. And the thing is that many of the things that made the study frustrating were fixable, if only they had bothered to ask and engage individuals in the design of that protocol. They weren't huge things. They were just things that matter when you're living and trying to manage a complex disease and go to work and have a life. And it's one thing if they're not fixable. It's completely different if they are. So what we're trying to do with Vital Crowd is to flip the process on its head. I feel very strongly right now that for the research process, for important historical reasons, has evolved into a situation where we kind of have the tail wagging the dog. We have researchers trying to guess what they think is important based on their clinical experience or their reading of the medical literature, going out doing prospective studies, and actually the same poor models being replicated for retrospective analysis, looking for things that everybody already knew was important as defined by researchers. What we're beginning to see now, particularly in type 1 diabetes community, which is sort of my peeps, is, I've been living with digital tools and data streams for more than 30 years that I use to take a very often fatal drug, insulin. It's very easy to make mistakes. It's very easy to do everything right and to still die in the middle of the night from an insulin overdose for who knows what reason. So we, patients, have expertise about our disease that our physicians will never have, if they're lucky, that researchers will never have. But none of that knowledge and understanding has been incorporated into the research enterprise. What we're trying to do with Vital Crowd is to flip that process on its head, to let people like me and the many others like me drive the research agenda based on all of this knowledge that we have by seeing the data from our sensors in real time, in context. And type 1 diabetes is kind of on the leading edge of this for a variety of reasons, but I really think, particularly as sensors proliferate, as smartphones are used in innovative ways with some of the built-in sensors that we have in smartphones, I think if you let those of us who live with disease or have children who have a disease define the best ways to actually figure out what's happening, that we'll actually get a lot further. And what I see so often, unfortunately, I think this is happening to a large extent with the PMI and with many other research enterprises that are designed to involve patients as true partners, is it gets taken over by the existing infrastructure and research enterprise of people who are really well-intended, well-meaning, but they begin to replicate the exact same structure that we've seen over and over again. And what we end up with is just tinkering at the edges, as opposed to actually changing the way things are done, where patients truly are driving the agenda and shaping it, as opposed to responding to, do you like this color of the website versus that color? Do you like the flat icon or the photo? And what I'm saying is that it's not just, don't involve us because it's the nice thing to do, or because it's the ethical thing to do. It is, and you should, but because it's the only way we're going to figure this stuff out is by involving those of us who live with disease. And we can't solve these problems if the people who had the most at stake are not involved in every element of solving them. And so far, that hasn't really happened, but I'm hopeful we can get there.
Thank you. So Holly, Anna set you up nicely there. It's hard to change, and part of change, particularly around this old-fashioned way of doing business where there are subjects and there are researchers. What do IRBs have to say about that? And this is about normative change, and normative change is hard. So what do you know?
So actually this is great. I mean, sometimes it's hard to go later in the panel because everything you wanted to say has been said already, but actually this does set things up very nicely. So I'm actually a lawyer by training and a bioethicist with expertise in research ethics, clinical trial oversight from the ethics and the regulatory side of things. And I'm involved in a project that's actually funded by PCORI that's called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Oversight Study, which is specifically devoted to trying to figure out when patients are engaged in research in non-traditional ways, right, when they're not just research participants or subjects. Do IRBs know what to do in those settings, right? And so many of you in this room can already articulate the various ways that patients might be involved in these non-traditional roles, right? They could be co-investigators, starting with, with the scientists to figure out what the research questions are going to be and how you're going to go about measuring them. They might be consultants or advisors at various points along the research trajectory, when it's being designed, when it's launched, when it's recruiting, when it's disseminating results to the public or to research participants and patient groups. They might help design surveys and do things of that nature. And they might also engage in other study staff roles, for example, pounding the pavement and helping to recruit other patients like themselves. And so these non-traditional roles can really raise some unique issues from the perspective of research oversight. So our project is wrapping up its second year of 3 years. We've started out by doing some interviews and case studies with sort of key opinion leaders, including patients, patient advocacy groups, IRBs, and others. And we're also now in the midst of doing a survey with IRB chairs around the country to get a better sense from them about what are the unique issues that come up in patient-centered outcomes research. So what we're hearing so far, all the data is not in, but what we're hearing so far is that IRBs know what to do when patients are subjects, because that's what the regulations talk about, right? There's a regulatory definition of a subject. IRBs are told, you need to make sure that there's adequate informed consent and those types of things. But when patients wear different hats, we're hearing that IRBs can sometimes be left adrift, and our goal is to, figure out what those issues are and provide some additional guidance that's not found in regulation, not yet offered by funders or by other institutions. So when we've talked to IRBs and other folks who are doing this kind of work, we hear that particularly IRBs will say, oh yeah, I know what patient-centered outcomes research is. And you say, oh, okay, what is it? And I said, well, it's patient-centered outcomes research, right? And it's very difficult for people to articulate what that really means and what that might mean from an oversight perspective, what the unique considerations might be. We've also heard, and I think this is a particularly interesting finding, when we ask IRBs, do you think it's your responsibility to make sure that patients are being meaningfully engaged in research? The answer that we frequently hear is no. Somebody ought to be making sure that they're meaningfully engaged, but it's not our role as the IRB. Our role as the IRB is to make sure that human subjects are protected. That's the purpose of this body. So somebody else has to make sure, whether it's the investigator or the funder or patient advocates pushing for this sort of thing. So when we get to patients and non-traditional roles, one question that we've asked is, for IRBs, do you feel the need or how do you treat patients when they are not subjects? And they say, oh, well, we just treat them like subjects. We often ask them to consent, even when they're not being enrolled in the study, they're wearing some different hat. It's kind of like, okay, if you've got a hammer, everything you see is a nail. We're used to seeing patients as subjects, and so that's how we're going to treat them. And I think that's problematic, right? Because it's not treating, yes, understatement, it's not treating patients as collaborators, right? It's treating them as in need of protection, and they don't necessarily need protection. They are co-investigators, those other roles. So that's something that we think is really important to change. There's also a sense from the IRB folks that we've talked to that yes, their responsibility is to protect research subjects, but they also have this underlying role of protecting research institutions from problems that might be associated sometimes with patients who are wearing these non-traditional, who are playing these non-traditional roles. So for example, it might be that patient collaborators will have access to identifiable private information about other people who are enrolling in the study. Are they trained to be able to utilize that information in an appropriate way? Have they signed the appropriate confidentiality agreements? Are there any special considerations that we need to keep in mind when patients are out there recruiting other patients like them, right? They might be very effective at doing that, but are there any subtle pressures, for example, or things that they may be doing that are kind of stepping over a line? So that leads to questions about what sorts of training patients as partners might need to have with regard to responsible conduct of research. And that question can lead to questions about the employment status of patients when they're wearing these different hats, right? So typically an institution can say to study staff, you have to follow all of these training requirements and do all of these modules because you're an employee. And if you're not an employee, or if you don't do them, you're not going to be an employee anymore, right? But if you're a patient who's not an employee? What jurisdiction does that institution have over you? So that's something that's come up in some of our conversations. Another sticky issue is how how patients should be paid when they are wearing these different hats. So oftentimes IRBs see payment to patient and they get worried about coercion and undue influence, and the response can typically be to behave conservatively and say, no payment, right? We're worried about this. But if a patient is a co-investigator or study staff, why should they not be paid just like everybody else who's participating in those roles? So that's something that we've also identified as a challenge. And the last point that I'll raise that's come up in the course of our work so far is something that's been raised a couple of times today already, this idea that patients, just like other investigators, might have conflicts of interest, perception of conflict of interest, depending on how they're funded or sort of which advocacy groups they might belong to. And so to the extent that we regulate or ask for disclosure of conflicts for co-investigators, then we want to do the same thing for patient collaborators. So those are the sorts of things that we're seeing in our work so far.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you're here. It's a lot of interesting work that I was not aware of, but it's so important. So now we have one more panelist before we go to questions. And so I'm priming you to be thinking about what questions you want to ask. And there will be a runner of a microphone, and at the end of this next bit, just raise your hand and we'll get audience questions going. So Rachel, hi.
I'm the closer.
You're the closer. So, Amgen, a sponsor, from your perspective, what are the practical realities of this on the ground in your business?
Sure. Maybe what I can do is summarize how we see the opportunities. We see them as an opportunity. We also think about privacy and representativeness of the patient voice. And the third thing is about developing the capability. So I'll touch on each of those. In terms of the opportunity, you've been hearing about it all day. It's coming from multiple stakeholders. I think a big driver for us are the regional health authorities. And this being a US meeting, we think about FDA as really the stakeholder here. What I would ask you to think about, though, is beyond the US borders. In Europe, for example, EMA has actually been quite ahead on this whole question about bringing the patient voice into drug development. We heard today about the PDUFA 6. We heard also about 21st Century Cures. In Europe, there has been a real drive to bring the patient voice in. There's an expectation that sponsors will develop lay summaries of their studies and make those available. All study documents need to be posted online in lay fashion. So there are drivers outside the US that we should be thinking about, and both FDA and Europe, EMA do influence smaller countries about how they approach the patient voice. So I think that's a perspective to keep in mind, that who the different sponsors are going to be thinking about in their activities. I think what's also important to think about is for every sponsor, the depth of their program is only as good as the input they get. And since the end user is the patient, it makes sense that you're going to want to bring that patient voice in to seek out advice about what does the development program look like, and what are ways that it can be executed in a meaningful way. Because what that will do is just expedite the way that these studies can be delivered, the data can be filed, hopefully approved in support of an application, either the primary indication or supplemental indication statements. Big piece is trying to think about what a health authority might see as label enabling. They have an expectation around substantial evidence that we need to honor to be able to put that into product labeling. So there may be very good data that we're able to accrue in seeking out the patient voice and bringing in patient-reported outcomes. The question will be, from a regulatory point of view, do they meet substantial evidence for product labeling, or is this something that's merely discussed in the scientific exchange that often takes place? And there are different avenues to be thinking about that. And I think that brings in the next point around the privacy and representativeness. You've probably heard that sponsors have been a bit leery about going out and seeking the patient voice because of privacy issues, truth be told. And there's been quite a bit my own team has had to navigate in dealing with our own operating procedures with compliance, our own privacy office, our legal arm, to make sure that any type of patient interaction is appropriate and that it's meeting that country level specific guidance. So as strict as things may be in the US about reaching out to patients, it's even stronger in Europe. And there are each country within the member states, there are 28 member states within Europe, and they each have their own guidance around patient privacy. So there's a lot of complexity to be considering and thinking about reaching out and seeking that patient voice. Aligned with that, and I think you heard a little bit about this from this panel and perhaps from some of the other panelists today, is, well, what is the representative patient voice? Is it the person who's speaking the most loudly? Does that represent the patient voice? Is it a professional patient who's been in multiple clinical trials? In all likelihood, there is no representative patient voice. There's probably going to be a heterogeneity of what voices that we hear. And the idea would be that we try and use those voices to come up with patterns of information. The FDA itself is trying to understand what is the patient voice and how does one make that representative. I think the third point is around capabilities. So this sounds easy. I can tell you for my team, I've taken quite a bit of interest, and so I volunteer them for a lot of things. It's actually not that easy. So an example is we have a pediatric study that we're currently conducting. We took the protocol through a simulation with patients. We had to negotiate this with the regional health authorities, so there wasn't a whole lot about the endpoints that we could do. However, we were very interested in understanding about the entry criteria, recruitment efforts, et cetera. And so we took this through a simulation. Well, where do you go? Who do you talk to, especially if it's a rare disease? And the investigator, in all likelihood, is going to be, who you're talking with, will probably be bringing a lot of those patients. And one needs to think about conflicts of interest. Are you, again, getting the representative patient voice, the representative investigator voice, or is this just a biased sampling that you're getting? So how do you bring that in, and how do you actually operationalize it in a culture where a lot of my compatriots will say, I can tell you what the patient voice is. You don't need to go and seek it. And you think to yourself privately, yeah, but the last time you saw patients was 20 years ago. So it's trying to keep things current and really holistically getting that information and developing the processes to make this happen seamlessly.
Wow, so it's complicated.
Yes, sir. However,
I feel less
doable.
ambitious than I
It
did.
is
Yeah.
doable. And if you look at different sponsors across the spectrum, and some of them are here today, that it is something that can be done. Each culture is slightly different, and the openness and the willingness to be innovative will differ. It's very clear, though, that if you don't get on board and start being active in the way you seek out that patient voice as a sponsor, you are not going to be able to deliver data to patients in a way that's going to be meaningful to them, and you're not going to be able to help patients really conquer their diseases.
So now we are going to take a few questions, but while that gets teed up, I want to go back to Holly and ask, how do we, so you're surveying IRBs, IRB chairs. What, in your opinion, is the process of, when you talk about sort of barriers to change, IRBs are idiosyncratic, and I'm a new member of an IRB at a medical school, and I joined because I was interested in innovating, sort of patient centricity, and the realities of how they're organized often makes that very difficult to do. I'm learning. So, in your opinion, what are the levers of change for IRBs? Is it, marketing to IRB chairs about, principles and realities and new models and capturing interesting things that other people are doing that they might want to try? Or
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that IRBs are the right place for innovation here. There is something that, there are things that they can do, though, really, right? They are beholden to a certain set of regulations, and
Yeah.
those regulations are focused on research involving human subjects, and that's their bread and butter, and that's what they know how to do. But there are some IRBs that are more creative, and they kind of step out of the comfort zone. For example, they develop protocol templates, and that dictates what the investigators have to submit. And even though it's not a regulatory requirement that they engage with, that investigators engage with patients in these non-traditional ways, something as simple as putting in a template. How have you engaged with patients in developing this protocol? Or how do you plan to return results to research participants? Or even just getting investigators to think about those questions. I mean, PCORI does that. Obviously, it's part of their mission, but not every investigator is funded by PCORI, and so that's a small step that IRBs can do. Whether they can drop the hammer and say we're not going to approve your study because you have not engaged patients is a different question. I do think there's an ethical responsibility to do that, and so that gives a lever sort of jurisdictionally to IRBs to say, look, this is something that's really important for you to do. But I don't think the whole onus, of course, lies on IRBs. It's something that they need to be able to facilitate this sort of research, not stand in the way of it, and help to get investigators thinking creatively about it. And also, they may need to reach out to other parts of the institution and not be too siloed, right? So I gave some examples where there might be HR questions that come up. How much can we pay this patient collaborator, but without them being responsible for taxes or something, or without them losing some subsidy that they might be getting from the government because now they're getting paid, or something of that nature. These are unique questions that they'll have to reach out to, the general counsel's office or the HR department or those types of things.
So just to be sure, what I'm hearing is that you're excited about opportunities to basically sort of work around IRBs and not necessarily make it not necessarily make it the domain of the IRB. I mean, because if you're a co-investigator, then there's not necessarily an issue. There's a different set of issues. Well, maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main point that I'm trying to make here is for IRBs, be aware that patients can be something other than subjects, right? And you don't have to have blinders on to think, okay, this is what we know how to do. They're subjects, they're subjects, they're subjects. They might be other types of things, and to be creative and facilitate that kind of engagement.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
This is the kind of thing that just makes me want to move to a mountain somewhere. And I don't mean that in any negative. I mean, anybody in this room is interested in this stuff and interested in doing the right thing, but it's I don't really care about the IRB. I know why it's there. I completely understand the history. I respect its role, why it's there, etc. But figuring out how to modify and change IRB policy isn't really going to help me get where I need to go to keep from dying in the middle of the night from an insulin overdose, or help my friends with children with rare diseases, like my brother and his 2 children, get the cures that they need. We have to find a way to break out of the current system. It needs to be ethical, etc. And I know it's very easy for me to say that on a panel, very different to do it, but we have to find a way to just start afresh with patients truly driving the agenda and not having to work around these existing structures that are slowing it down. Because as long as our focus is on modifying and innovating these existing structures, we're never going to get there.
So I think this is really an important point, right? Because the history of the IRBs, we're in a time where investigators were doing things to patients, right? In this very active versus passive circumstance. And we saw examples where things had been done inappropriately, and so need some outside organization to come in and oversee. But in this new world where we have patient collaborators, maybe patients don't need to be protected in that way, right? If it's not us versus them, it's we, then there might be a completely different model that the existing IRB system doesn't quite fit into. I think that's a really important point.
That's very much what we're trying to do with Vital Crowd, is to let the crowd police the system.
And I just want to add something in, because I think from a pragmatic perspective, there's always the disruptive innovation, and you want to get to the disruption, and there's this pragmatic period in between. So I also think, and I know PCORI has undertaken activities, I've obviously given my tenure, been less involved, but trying to think about how do we support investigators and others communicating with IRBs. You know, we come from a perspective of you gotta hit all cylinders, right? Because you gotta try to do it in all ways. So in addition to trying to think about, and I think with engagement generally, everybody needs to be trained to support it. Like thinking that people are gonna understand how to do it when they have no exposure to it, don't know how to think about it because they're primarily focusing on patient safety, is say, wait a minute, let's spin this around. So I do think it's incumbent on funders and others to say, hey, here's the things, and PIs can help their IRBs to understand, to start moving that needle. Ultimately, all the disruption we might want, there's a long process to getting there, and I just want to be sure that we're still thinking about how we're going to move them from the perspective of sharing how this can be different, what it would be different, and training and having a conversation.
Okay, let's get a question from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes. Why don't you introduce yourself and your name, where you're from, and then your question.
I'm Megan O'Boyle, and I'm Shannon's mom. Shannon has a rare genetic condition that's chronic, and we spend lots of times in hospitals, and she's in a clinical trial. I'm also a PI of a registry and a PI of a PCORI-funded project. And I have no problem with my IRB. It's a commercial IRB, and they're reasonable, and I play by the rules, and they play by the rules. I've had my city ethics training. I keep it up to date. And they do their job, I do mine. They've never come back with anything unreasonable. The researchers that I've met in the last 5 years that I've been in this space seem to be afraid of IRBs because they have careers and they need to protect them. And IRBs seem to be afraid of regulators because they have their rules and they need to put them in place. And I can say this because I'm a volunteer and you can't fire me. It's insanely ridiculous, all this protection that goes on. Supposedly, for me, the patient or the proxy, you know, I've said this before publicly, I believe in seatbelts, but I don't need 3 seatbelts and you know, a crash helmet to go around the block. And that's what IRBs are trying to put in place. And never, ever have I heard of a circumstance, and maybe I'm wrong, where a patient who's involved in the study would be invited into a room. I mean, they're not, you know, taking place, having these meetings on Mars. Have a patient who's going to be in the study and say, hey, Jane, do you think this protocol makes sense? Do you think that this is risky? Is this something? It just seems so common sense. So maybe there's a law about it I don't know about, because first and foremost, I'm Shannon's mom and not a lawyer. But I just think for this culture to change, we have to change it. And I think to change it, you have to bring in the patient voice, people like me who feel passionately, because I think if researchers make these comments, then it looks like they're trying to just get the research done without thinking about the ethics. And you know, they look like they're serving their own career. So I think that someone needs to help the patient community get organized and say, okay, you know what? The IRB thing was really important, and it still is, but the purposes it was put in place for are different now. The environment has changed, and we need to change with it, and stop talking about this at meetings and actually make some changes. And I think single IRBs are great. There's a lot of changes that are happening, and PCORI is responsible for a lot of them, and so is NIH. But I just think that some of this, it's protecting institutions. It's not protecting me. And the things that they're trying to protect me from, I don't care about. It's not in my concerns. And so I'm not saying do away with the IRBs. I'm just saying that it's time for change, as Anna said. But I also wanted to point out something happy. Also through a PCORI-funded study, we were able to get our patient community together with researchers. And for 8 hours, they talked about 8 topics. And from that, we have research questions that the researchers will now make priorities. And so our patient community came up with research questions, they prioritized them, we put out white papers, and research, you know, hopefully will get funded according to. And it wasn't that hard to do. and it's definitely scalable. So I don't think some of what we're talking about here today is, for the future, 10 years down the road. It's things that can be implemented now. So thank you.
Thank you. There was a question over here.
Yeah, thank you. What a great panel. So my name's Kelly Close, and I work on chronic disease, especially diabetes and prediabetes and obesity. And it's so awesome to hear you all talk about needing more bridges between researchers and patients and starting to make that happen. And I'm wondering what you feel is the place of the clinicians, because I know in our fields, we're really worried about the clinicians not even having time to understand where the research is going and what does it mean, and especially in very diverse patient populations, understanding how to sort of translate that. So maybe some of you could talk about that.
Sohini, I think this one's for you.
We talked about this a little bit in our prep call. So this is a really interesting area, and we at the foundation are now utilizing the term closing the loop. Because when you talk about engaging with patients, to ignore the clinician or treating physician aspect is really short-sighted. In Parkinson's disease, most patients actually are not treated by specialists trained in movement disorders, which are called movement disorder specialists. They are actually treated either by their general physician. They may be treated by a neurologist who maybe has treated a handful, if you're lucky, Parkinson's patients over their lifetime. So they are often not up to date on the latest in research. They're not up to date on the latest in therapeutic advances. They're not up to date on the holistic way you should now view Parkinson's or treat Parkinson's. And very importantly, when it does come to research opportunities, often an individual will go to their treating physician and ask for their opinion on a clinical research opportunity. And if you had not built roads to the treating physicians, you end up not being able to truly engage with that patient in the way that you really want to. And we've seen this in two ways. One is that often now, clinicians will never offer genetic testing to Parkinson's patients. In their mind, there's no reason they should, because there's no treatment paradigm that's going to be affected if you have a particular mutation. That's true in the here and the now, but what research is telling us is that there are actually, and we know because there are trials that are happening, is that we need specific populations that are defined by genetic mutations. Yet the entire Parkinson's population in the United States is not being offered that when they're being diagnosed or over the course of their treatment. So for sponsors, they're dealing with the issue that they have a much harder time finding individuals, because those individuals don't know their mutation. They've never been offered the opportunity. They wouldn't know where to go for it. They may have not even heard that there is a genetic aspect to the disease, because that's relatively new, and many treating physicians may not even talk about that. So this actually hinders everything. It hinders the aspect of, what do I think for my family? What are familial implications of the disease? It impacts research, being able to find these populations, engage with them. It impacts being able to talk to them and make them understand that there's precision medicine, and that they themselves should think about the role that they can play as an individual, because you need those individuals, and individualism is important. So that's, I think, one area where this lack of being able to reach the physician is really important. The second aspect is, you see a physician for 20 minutes when you have Parkinson's disease, maybe every 6 months or 12 months. It's a chronic disease. How you ate that day, whether you traveled, when you took your medication, did you have a good night of sleep, all of that impacts how your physician sees you in those 20 minutes. And often we know patients admit that they perform for the physician because they want to get a good result, whatever that may mean. So what happens is that you're not really getting real-life feedback about how your disease is going. And you're not perhaps being told of the opportunities and the ways that you can get engaged in research, because the physician's not seeing the state of your real condition, your day-to-day existence. And I think this is something where, again, not to harp on technology, but there's an opportunity here to make clinicians' lives easier and to be able to leverage, not just for Parkinson's, but for diseases all around, and to be able to give real-world time feedback about the state of an individual. But I think it's one of the biggest issues when we talk about engagement is the fact that we actually don't talk about the clinician, and the treating physician is often the gateway for many diseases to patients, and particularly patients of certain ethnicities, etc. You want to be able to build trust, and that trust often starts with the treating physician.
So I'm just going to this is in the last minute. I'm going to ask each of the panelists here, who have just been amazing, to give us their thought about what they think the highest impact way to get more people to routinely engage in organized health research. Because as we've seen in this room, it's still a fringe activity. We can do better. These are people working on the frontiers of research and participant engagement. So to you, is it technology? Is it the clinician? If you had to choose one thing to focus on, what's the highest impact way to engage more people in research?
Wow. I think it's, this is sort of, I hope this answers it, and I hope people don't think I'm punting, but I think patient centricity and patient engagement are actually the buzzwords of the past 2 years. And I actually don't think it means the same thing to different people and to different stakeholders. And I think that's part and parcel the problem. We recently worked with a pharma company who we organized a day with 8 patients, and it was incredibly engaging. And afterwards, the pharma company came to us and said, yeah, well, I know they didn't like the flyer, but it's printed, so we're going to use it. They were engaged. They were asking. They were so touched. They were like incredibly engaged in that day, yet there was no, the there wasn't there. And I think that that's the biggest issue still, is that what we really mean by true patient engagement or patient centricity is not really embraced and understood across all the stakeholders. And that's a rate limiting step.
So I hear loud and clear team-based science from you. Mm-hmm. Okay, Holly.
So one of the things that I think would be really helpful is to expand the cadre of patients who are able to play this role. Certainly, you know, patients all have their own experience, but when I go to these meetings, I see often the same faces who are the patient advocates or the people who are tapped to play this role of co-investigator or collaborator. And not that they're not great, but they certainly have a limited amount of time, right? So they can't be overburdened and engaged on all sorts of different projects. But there's also, frankly, a worry that they may not actually represent the typical patient because they are so engaged in the research community that they might have higher levels of education or access to certain resources that other types of patients may not have. And so when we think about whose experience they're representing, it may not be adequately representative of the entire patient community that's suffering with a particular disease. So I don't know if that's training or what other sort of reach out mechanisms there are, but I think we just need more patients who are able to engage in this way. And it's a challenge because they're already burdened with their disease. They're burdened with research participation, burdened in so many ways, and we're asking something else of them. But I do think that's a key.
Anna?
Just one, huh?
Only one.
Gosh, if you have a funding mechanism, don't fund any research unless there's more than just one patient involved in the design of every aspect of it. Use the levers that we have, incentivize it, and don't fund it if it isn't there. Don't fund the things that are tweaking at the edges. Fund the risky stuff, the quote-unquote risky stuff, because those of us who live with disease live with risk, and we have a much bigger appetite for it, and the research enterprise is not going to change until we are willing to embrace the risk and take the risk in bringing patients in a meaningful way.
I hear you. Okay, Kristen.
Well, I just want to remark what I love about that is it's simple action that doesn't require simple change. It says as a simple change, anybody could say, I am not going to fund something if there's just a token patient. I am not going to do an action if there's a token patient. So I love that. At the more macro level, I would also sort of beg the question and say it's an accumulation of simple and a number of actions. I think one of the things PCORI has shown is that you can really move the needle when you do lots of things. But circling back to closing the loop, which I think is one of many crucial actions, PCORI is publicly reporting all its findings for patients and clinicians. It is creating a program that allows investigators, when they have proven effective approaches, to find ways of disseminating them. I think if you want to make a difference in this arena, getting information back to people at the point of care, at the point of what's happening, is going to make a difference in their involvement, whether it's patients and providers, although I do think it's a multi-action system.
You get the final word, Rachel.
Don't underestimate the power of social media to engage consumers who then, when they learn of their disease, become patients.
And we haven't even touched on that, so that's ample opportunity in the future to come back to that issue. And so help me and thank these panelists today. And thank you for your participation.